just been thinking about Philip Auslander's new book, which is about theory for performance studies. It's a kind of a reader, an introductory reader or a textbook for undergraduate students in performance studies who need some theory, I guess, or for tutors who want to introduce theory to those students. And broadly speaking, it's critical and cultural theory. People like Saussure, Marx, Freud, Deleuze-Guattari, a whole bunch of people like that. And one of the things that I find quite interesting in that is in the introduction to the book, Auslander makes a distinction between theatre studies and performance studies, which I think I've mentioned before, and kind of sets up the ambition for the book. But I don't think he really fulfills that ambition. I don't think he follows through on it. So what he says is that he starts off by making this distinction between theatre studies and performance studies. He says theatre studies is what he calls object-based, by which he means that if you're going to be a theatre studies person, you identify a series of events or phenomena in the world called theatre, and then you find a way to study them. So you might go and see a particular play or a particular performance of some kind, and then apply a wide range of different theoretical strategies to understand it. So you might think about the biography of the playwright, or you might think about the use of language in the writing of the text, or you might think about something to do with scenography, or you might apply some kind of philosophical or even scientific theory to an understanding of any aspect of that theatre piece. And there's lots and lots of different approaches to that. But the object of those approaches is the same. It's this object called theatre, or a particular theatre event at the centre. And that he contrasts with performance studies. And I think his understanding or his announcement of what performance studies is a bit idiosyncratic. Useful, I think, but idiosyncratic. And he says that performance studies is what he calls paradigm-based, which says there are events called performances, and those performances have a kind of he doesn't use this kind of language, but he says it kind of implies that these performances all have a similar paradigmatic structure to them, and that structure can be used as an analytical framework in its own right to understand other events which don't happen in theatre spaces, or which don't have an obvious performance element to them. So as I think I've mentioned before, although he doesn't cite these examples, I don't think, you could talk about consciousness as a performance, as indeed Bernard Bars does in Theatre of the Mind, or Theatre of Consciousness, Workspace of the Mind, something like that, as Irving Goffman does in terms of interpersonal behaviour, presentation of self in everyday life, where he talks about roles and that kind of thing, or in terms of scientific experiments, as Robert Crease does, in which the experiment is a kind of performance. And I think I've written myself a little bit about it in terms of an understanding of the creative process can be analysed as having a performance structure to it. And what else? Well, I know John Mackenzie talks about it quite a bit in a book called Perform or Else. So that seems to be what Auslander's project is in this book. That's what he says this project is going to be about. A differentiation between theatre studies as an object-based area of study, form of study, performance studies as a paradigm-based form of study. And that's where it gets strange, because up to that point I think that's fine, that's great. But there's some oddities follow from that. The first thing is that performance studies as a field of practice doesn't really match up to that understanding. Any performance studies program that you might come across at a university, or if you go on the website, performancestudies.org, or any of those kind of well-known sites, that's certainly not how performance studies is understood. And those kinds of examples I've given, whilst they might feature, they're certainly not central to that understanding. Performance studies is a kind of strange amalgam of what he would think of as theatre studies, something object-based in which you identify events and ways of interpreting them, and paradigm-based. And a lot of performance studies comes from anthropology, leaning on Richard Schechner and Victor Turner's work and that kind of thing. So there's something peculiar about that. The second peculiar thing is that after Auslander has made this distinction, he then ignores it for the rest of the book, apparently. Because, as I say, the rest of the book is a series of short essays and kind of contextualizing paragraphs attached to those essays, which really outline critical theory and cultural theory, not performance theory as he sort of describes it in the introduction. So he's talking about Deleuze and Guattari, he's talking about Saussure, he's talking about Marx and Freud, but those people aren't using performance paradigms. If anything, they're using literary paradigms. They're using writing. Also, some of them are. Certainly, Saussure is coming from language, the study of language, written and spoken language, and kind of from the philosophy of knowledge. They're not using performance paradigms. So that's a bit peculiar, really. I mean, having said all that, I think there's a lot of mileage in what he says about using this idea that performance could be a paradigm-based area of study.